Right now, without thinking about it at all, you are doing something that took evolution approximately 2 million years to pull off. You are understanding words, not grunting at them, not running from them, actually understanding them, stringing them into meaning, building entire worlds out of thin air with nothing but sound waves and a brain that somehow knows what to do with them. Your ancient ancestor, sitting on the African savanna 2 million years ago, could not do this. He woke up, looked around, and communicated his entire emotional range through a series of sounds that, if you heard them today, you would assume someone was having a very bad time in the next room. So, how did we get from there to here? How did the species that started out yelling at each other across a field end up writing poetry, arguing on the internet, and delivering 17-minute TED Talks about the power of vulnerability? The answer involves millions of years, a bone in your throat, a lot of chimpanzees, and one evolutionary trade-off so absurd that once you hear it, you will never eat a sandwich the same way again. Let's start at the bottom, literally. Most mammals have their larynx, the voice box, sitting high in their throat. This is actually a fantastic design feature. It means they can breathe and swallow at the same time without choking. Efficient, safe, sensible. A dog can gulp water while still getting air. A chimpanzee can eat a banana and breathe simultaneously. Very practical. Humans cannot do this. At some point in our evolutionary history, our larynx descended. It dropped to a lower position in the throat, creating a long curved chamber above it. This chamber, called the pharynx, is what allows us to produce the enormous range of vowel sounds that make language possible. It is also what makes us choke on food. That's the trade. That is the literal evolutionary bargain our species made. We traded the ability to safely eat a grape for the ability to write a symphony. We gave up basic swallowing competence for Shakespeare. Every single time a human being chokes at a dinner table, that is evolution collecting on a very old debt. Was it worth it? Debatable. Ask anyone who's ever had to perform the Heimlich on a relative at Christmas. But here's the thing. That descended larynx opened up a world of sounds no other animal could produce. And eventually, some ancestor of ours looked at that world of sounds and thought, what if each one meant something specific? That is the leap. That is the moment everything changed. Before language, there was communication, and it worked. Vervet monkeys, for example, have distinct alarm calls for different predators. One call for eagles, a different one for leopards, a different one for snakes, and other vervets respond to each call appropriately. Diving for cover at the eagle call, climbing trees at the leopard call, scanning the ground at the snake call. That is not nothing. That is real information being transferred between animals in real time. That is a symbol standing in for a thing in the world. Your ancestors were doing something like this for hundreds of thousands of years before anything resembling actual language appeared. The calls were more numerous, more nuanced, more layered, but the basic structure was the same. Sound means thing. Hear sound, respond to thing. The problem is that kind of system has a ceiling, a hard one. You can warn each other about predators. You can signal the location of food. You can communicate immediate emotional states with impressive accuracy. What you cannot do is talk about last Tuesday. You cannot say, so I was by the river yesterday and I noticed that the berry bushes on the eastern bank are coming into season about 2 weeks early this year, which probably means the migration route needs adjusting. You cannot plan. You cannot speculate. You cannot tell a story about something that happened before in a place that isn't here to someone who wasn't there. Human language does all of this effortlessly. Linguists call it displacement. The ability to communicate about things removed from the immediate present in time and space. It sounds like a technical term. What it actually is one of the most extraordinary cognitive achievements in the history of life on Earth. Because displacement means you can warn your children about a predator they have never seen. It means you can describe a route through a mountain pass to someone who has never traveled it. It means accumulated knowledge can survive the death of the person who first acquired it. It means culture becomes possible. Civilization becomes possible. Everything you know that you didn't personally experience came to you through displacement. Every history lesson, every recipe your grandmother passed down, every piece of advice that actually turned out to be useful, all of it is displacement. All of it required language. Now, the brain, the physical equipment, is only half the story. The descended larynx gives you the range of sounds, but producing language also requires a brain capable of a assigning meaning to those sounds and then recombining them in new configurations to express ideas that have never been expressed before. That last part matters enormously. Human language is generative, productive. A child who has never heard the sentence, "The purple elephant apologized," to the confused accountant can understand it immediately. Because language isn't a list of memorized phrases. It's a system of rules that lets you construct and understand sentences that have never existed before in the history of the universe. That is a genuinely staggering cognitive capability, and it took a brain that was being reorganized and expanded over millions of years to make it possible. The brain regions most associated with language, Broca's area handling speech production and Wernicke's area handling comprehension, began expanding in our lineage roughly 2 million years ago. We can see this in fossil skulls. The inside of a skull preserves faint impressions of the brain's outer surface, and researchers can measure how these regions changed over time across millions of years of human evolution. The brain was, in other words, building up to this, quietly, incrementally, for a very long time. So when did language actually arrive? The honest answer is nobody knows exactly, and the people who study this professionally argue about it with an intensity that suggests it might be personal. For a long time, the dominant theory was that language appeared suddenly around 50,000 years ago in what researchers called the behavioral revolution. Suddenly cave paintings, suddenly complex tools, suddenly long-distance trade and personal ornaments, and evidence of abstract symbolic thinking, all appearing in the archaeological record at roughly the same period. The theory was some genetic mutation, some neural rewiring, and modern human cognition just switched on overnight. Except the more archaeologists dig in Africa, the more that sudden revolution looks like a coincidence of where we were digging, rather than when the change actually happened. Ochre pigments, used for body decoration, show up in South Africa 200,000 years ago. Geometric engravings appear 75,000 years ago. Pierced shell beads, used as personal ornaments, show up at roughly the same time across multiple sites with no contact between them, which means multiple groups of humans independently decided that wearing a small hole-punched shell around their neck meant something. That is deeply interesting, because a necklace that signals your status only works if other people understand what it signals. That shared symbolic understandings, in a meaningful sense, language adjacent. It requires a communication system capable of assigning arbitrary meaning to arbitrary objects and transmitting that meaning across a group, which pushes the likely origin of language considerably further back than anyone used to think. Not a sudden switch, more like a very long dimmer that someone was slowly turning up over hundreds of thousands of years. There is also the Neanderthal problem, which tends to make certain researchers visibly uncomfortable. We found a Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small curved bone in the throat that anchors the tongue muscles, dating to roughly 60,000 years ago. Its shape is essentially identical to a modern human hyoid. The anatomy for complex speech was there. The brain was large and sophisticated, and some genetic evidence suggests Neanderthals carried the same version of FOXP2, a gene strongly associated with language ability that modern humans carry. Were they talking? Possibly. Not necessarily with full grammatical complexity, but the case for some form of language-capable Neanderthal is considerably stronger than the old narrative of them as grunting brutes. They were not grunting brutes. They were doing brain surgery and making jewelry and deliberately burying their dead with apparent ceremony. These are not the hobbies of a species with nothing to say. Here is what we can say with reasonable confidence. By 100,000 years ago, something was happening in our species that was meaningfully different from any other communication system on Earth. Not necessarily the full Baroque complexity of modern grammar, but symbolic, displaced, generative enough to carry knowledge across generations. And when modern humans left Africa between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, they carried that capability with them across deserts and mountains and oceans, into environments no human ancestor had ever seen. And wherever they went, they talked. They warned each other. They argued. They made each other laugh. They told stories about the dead and built elaborate explanations for things they didn't understand yet. Every mythology, every religion, every origin story in every culture on Earth is a product of that first great outpouring of language into the dark. Here's what actually gets me about all of this. For the first 100,000 years of human existence, every piece of knowledge that kept your ancestors alive lived inside someone's head. There were no books, no writing, no recording of any kind, just memory and mouth and the willingness of someone to sit down with the next generation and talk. Every route through every dangerous landscape, every plant that healed and every plant that killed, every technique for making fire and napping stone and reading weather, every lesson learned at catastrophic cost that meant the next person didn't have to learn it the same way. All of it passed mouth to ear across hundreds of generations, an unbroken chain of spoken words stretching back 100,000 years, all the way to you, sitting here right now understanding this. The oldest technology our species ever built isn't stone tools or fire. It isn't the wheel or the city or the printing press. It's this, the sound in your throat that means something to someone else. Everything else we ever made came after. Everything else we ever became started here. 2 million years in the making, paid for in choking hazards, worth every single one.